Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Sunday, everybody. My apologies once again for interrupting your Sunday. I hope you're all having a restful weekend. But again, just like last week, there are simply too many important developments from this week which we need to cover before we move into next week's videos regarding new updates in China. So today's episode will act as a supplementary episode covering a couple of important topics from this week before we move on. So let's just jump in. More cities are reporting outbreaks and lockdowns this week. Cities like Xining, Lhasa and Zhengzhou are looking quite serious with cases. While these are not Tier 1 megacities, they are hardly backwaters either, and large-scale lockdowns will be painful for the economy and of course for the people affected. We will look at some of these in a moment, as we are also seeing social instability concerns in these localities. As we will soon see too, the outbreak in Zhengzhou Foxconn facility may cause some serious headaches for Apple, especially as it gears up for this year's production of new iPhones. Other large cities across China, including Datong, Wuhan, and Xi'an, have implemented new curbs this week to rein in local outbreaks. State media reports that over the weekend we're currently in, Shanxi, Fujian and Qinghai provinces have also seen a rapid development of infections. On the positive side of the ledger, however, outbreaks in Guangdong province, Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang in the west appear to be at a plateau, in the words of state media. However, state media also admits that national case numbers are, quote, concerningly high and growing, end quote. Millions of residents across the country are now directly affected by lockdowns. Indeed, according to investment bank Nomura, as of Monday this week, a little more than 200 million people are affected by some degree of lockdowns in 28 cities. And this number has risen this week. We note the usage here of affected by some degree of lockdowns. This does not mean that all 200 million people are locked in their homes, but affected by these lockdowns, though we should note that millions are locked in their homes. The situation in the poor northwestern city of Xining has spread on social media within China, sparking anger. The capital city of Qinghai province, population 2.5 million, went into a snap lockdown last week. This week, residents have taken to social media pleading for food and other essentials. One widely shared plea for food asked for steamed buns or cakes for their grandfather, who could only digest soft foods. However, because the neighborhood that he was living in was sealed off, the elderly man died the following day. On Wednesday of this week, officials in the city laid out efforts to provide meat and vegetables for residents while asking them to bear with efforts to stamp out the virus. The situation in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, will be making officials, both local and at the national level, nervous too, as reports and some video dripping out of the locality show moderately sized demonstrations and protests. However, as the information environment there is so tight, it's difficult to judge the nature and true scope of these social disturbances. This week too, we also received more details on Shanghai's plan for a permanent quarantine center on a nearby island. The recently announced quarantine center will cost over $220 million and will be built on a small island in Shanghai's Huangpu River. The facility will have over 3,000 isolation rooms and 3,250 beds. The construction is expected to be completed in 6 months. The permanent building will replace the original makeshift facility, which was built in April in response to the surging cases, which eventually led to the lockdown of Shanghai for 2 months. Now, let's finish part 1 on the lockdowns by looking at Apple's Zhengzhou problem. This week, like the Xining residents just mentioned, workers at the world's largest iPhone factory, run by Foxconn Technology Group in the central Chinese city of Zhengzhou, provincial capital of Henan, turned to social media for help amid strict pandemic control measures on their work campus that have been imposed since last week. In the midst of peak iPhone production season, as Apple prepares for the holidays, Foxconn has sealed off its Zhengzhou campus since last Wednesday in order to maintain operations. However, videos of chaotic scenes have been shared, and many voiced their anger about the restrictions and measures. Like Xining, the posts have sparked outrage from Chinese internet users who accuse the company of failing to be transparent and downplaying the situation on the ground, with the hashtag #ZhengzhouFoxCon briefly trending on Weibo, a popular social media platform in China this week. We remember that the lockdown in Zhengzhou began early last week when people in more than a dozen neighborhoods in the central Zhongyuan district, west of the Foxconn factory, were told to stay at home. One worker at the factory, speaking to Hong Kong media on the condition of anonymity, expressed that the actual number of cases at the plant is, quote, much higher than reported, end quote. And by the way, we should note that this work campus is big. As of this year, the Foxconn Zhengzhou campus has about 300,000 workers, making it bigger than many Western cities. Restrictions for the city itself, Zhengzhou, population 10 million, intensified over the last 48 hours. On Friday evening, the local government imposed new measures, including a quasi-lockdown of the entire city, and many of the buildings and streets will be going through mass-scale disinfection. The local government has also ordered the closure of non-essential businesses, while allowing select whitelisted companies to continue operating. The Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post writes today that these large-scale sanitization efforts have become controversial in China, especially after the lockdown in Shanghai in April and May, with experts expressing concern for human health. So we can see across the country the outbreak and lockdown situation in China has deteriorated greatly this week. We will continue to follow the situation as we move into next week. Hey guys, China Update is a channel primarily supported by subscribers like you guys rather than corporate sponsorship. So if you like what I'm doing here with the channel and you would like to help me continue doing it, if you think China Update is worth a damn and you are able to go that extra mile, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This is one of the best ways you can help me continue making these episodes for you guys every day. If you're liking this episode in particular, don't forget to hit the like button. And as always, thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Next up, we also need to touch on US chip, that is, semiconductor chip, ban-related developments from this week. This week, a US official in charge of the Bureau of Industry and Security inside the US Department of Commerce, which is implementing the new chip controls, told an audience at an event in Washington this week that the US expects allies to get on board with the controls. They also expressed that, quote, further controls around biotech and AI are likely, end quote. The event was hosted by the Washington-based Center for a New American Security on Thursday, and the multilateral controls are, quote, a work in progress, end quote, according to the official. Meanwhile, in an interview this week, Dan Wang, a highly respected technology analyst at Beijing-based Dragonomics, expressed that the restrictions from the US now are going to roll back China's progress to something like 2015 capabilities. Quote, China is very plausibly going to be at around 2015 levels of technology, and so when we consider when it can progress from 2015 levels of technology up to something like 5 nanometers, the first thing to recognize that they have been really significantly rolled back. So it's very easy to gesture towards the future without giving any concrete sense of timelines. But I think that within the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years, China is going to be really substantially behind on the domestic manufacture of advanced chips, in that 5 nanometers even is going to be quite out of reach for the next 5 to 10 years, end quote. A report by Fathom China, an internal research team at Dragonomics, warned this week that China's most important semiconductor companies will be, quote, destroyed, damaged, or circumscribed, end quote, by the latest US measures, and that, quote, no Chinese company involved in the semiconductor industry is untouched, end quote. Matt Sheehan at the Carnegie Endowment for World Peace writes this week that the new restrictions also attempt to settle a long-running debate within US technology policy. He argues that the debate centers on a perceived trade-off between two competing goals, damaging Chinese capabilities today versus maintaining American leverage in the future. With the latest rules, he says the US government is, quote, betting that it can so deeply undermine China's semiconductor fabrication capabilities that it won't matter how motivated or well-resourced China's efforts are to create new semiconductor industry, they simply won't be able to catch up, end quote. Meanwhile, more China-based firms and manufacturing sites have announced major downsizing plans this week. China-based analysts have been unambiguous about the hit these US restrictions have done to domestic chip ambitions. Quote, "This is probably the most difficult and coldest moment in China's semiconductor industry. A war has been declared." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Once again, my apologies for interrupting your Sunday. I hope you do have a good and restful weekend, and I will see you back with regular episodes of China Update on Monday tomorrow.